They called him the Black Cartel boss from Memphis, a man who didn't just hustle, he rewrote the rules. Craig Petties came from poverty and climbed straight into the world of international drug trafficking, linking up with Mexico's most violent cartel. What started as a neighborhood hustle turned into a multi-state empire that left bodies and fear behind. For years, he ran the streets untouched, hidden behind money, loyalty, and murder. But power like that doesn't last forever. And when his empire began to crumble, the truth was darker than anyone expected. Craig Petties' story reads like something straight out of a movie. A young kid from the Memphis streets who climbed his way from small-time hustling to running one of the biggest drug operations the city had ever seen. It's not just his rise that makes it wild. It's what his story says about how deep the drug game runs in America and how Memphis became one of its main highways. Born in 1976, Craig grew up in South Memphis, raised by his mother, Jean Petties, in a tiny brick house on West Decent Avenue. She worked hard, juggling jobs as a foster parent and with the school board, pulling in just enough to keep the lights on. The house cost $17,000, but it held more struggle than comfort. Memphis, at that time, was rough. Fatherless homes were the norm, poverty was everywhere, and the streets were often the only place young boys felt they had any power. Craig's half-brother, Paul Beauregard, better known as DJ Paul from 3-6 Mafia, came up just a few miles away. Different paths, same city, same struggle. By the late 80s, crack had the whole South on lock, and Petties jumped in early, moving small amounts in a neighborhood cops already knew as a hotspot. Folks around there called him Lil C because he was short, but that name would soon mean something else entirely. Memphis had long been a drug hub, way before Petties ever touched the streets. Back in 1931, the feds busted a man named Jimmy Gowling, who was shipping morphine and opium out of the city using cars, planes, and boats. Even as far back as 1900, Memphis drugstores were staying open late, selling cocaine for 5 cents a pop. The city had history with drugs. It just kept changing hands, from Chinese opium rings to black and Mexican traffickers, and yes, plenty of white folks too. For Petties, trouble came early. In 1992, at just 15, he got caught with a sawed-off shotgun. The crazy part? He called the police himself after accidentally firing it inside his own home. Not long after, he dropped out of school and started stacking arrests, selling crack twice in '93 and catching an attempted murder charge that winter. The victim survived, and Petties slipped through the cracks, with juvenile court letting him off lighter than the streets probably would have. A psychologist named Dr. Robert Parr examined him that same year. He described a polite but rebellious kid, 5'5", 130 pounds, full of anger toward authority and no impulse control. His IQ test came back borderline low, but it wasn't intelligence holding him back. It was the environment around him and the choices he made in it. Then came March 1995. One night that changed everything. That's when Craig Petties stopped being just another Memphis hustler and started his transformation into something much bigger, the most dangerous and powerful drug lord the Bluff City had ever known. In March of 1995, Petties was just 18 and already feeling the pressure. The small-time hustle, selling crack and little bags of weed around the neighborhood, wasn't cutting it anymore. He needed real money, fast. He was still living at home with his sister and his mom, Jean Petties. Their old yard tree had become a problem, one of those leaning lightning magnet types that could come down any storm. So when the chance came to make a serious come up, Petties jumped. That opportunity came through his older cousin, Antonio Big Wayne Allen. Around that time, federal agents had arrested a known South Memphis drug supplier and impounded his blue Chevrolet Lumina. The word on the street was that the car had $500,000 stashed inside, tucked away in a hidden compartment. The car was sitting at a private impound lot, basically a big industrial car yard, guarded by one lonely security guard. The arrested dealer promised a hefty cut to anyone who could get to that cash before the feds did. Big Wayne brought the plan to Petties. Allen was the heavier one, but Petties was lean and quick, perfect for the job. So Petties and one of his boys climbed a fence using a ladder, while Allen and another cousin stood watch. They followed the dealer's instructions exactly, cracked open that secret compartment, and sure enough, $500,000 in cash was waiting. But here's where the hustle turned cold. Instead of turning the money over to the dealer, they decided to keep it all. They split it between themselves, banking on the dealer not being the type to retaliate. Lucky for them, they were right. Petties' share was supposed to be $100,000, but since he was the youngest, he only got half. He used part of it to take care of home, paid to get that old tree removed for his mom, and spent the rest on a Cadillac. The smart move, though, came when he reinvested the remaining cash. He started buying wholesale amounts of drugs, flipping them fast, and doubling up. In just a few years, Petties went from being a neighborhood hustler to running the streets of Memphis. The old supplier sat behind bars, and Petties had taken his spot and then some. He became the main plug, controlling a network that stretched across the city and eventually leading the Memphis branch of the gangster Disciples. He wasn't just running a crew anymore, he was running an empire. He brought in his cousins Clinton and Martin Lewis, known as Goldie and M, who stood by him through everything. By 21, Petties caught his first adult charge for breaking into rail yard boxcars in 1998. His mom, Evergene, refused to speak on any of it. She wouldn't entertain interviews or questions about her son's growing reputation, but the money told its own story. At 22, Petties paid $185,000 cash for a house in Hickory Hill, a middle-class suburb, and cleared the balance not long after. His associates were doing the same, buying up homes, living like suburban kings. One trafficker, Reuben Laurel, later told investigators they once counted over $1 million sitting right on the pool table inside Petties' house. From there, the spending only got bolder. A $339,000 Bentley, a $112,000 Mercedes-Benz, and even property out in Las Vegas. By the time he was just 23, Petties was already running things on a whole different level. This wasn't some street corner hustle. This man was moving serious weight. He had pulled together a massive haul, about 200 pounds of weed and another 22 pounds of cocaine. But he wasn't the one out there getting his hands dirty. Now he had middlemen doing the heavy lifting, and those dudes had direct ties straight into Mexico. All that drug money didn't just sit around either. The cash was stacked up and hidden across properties all over West Tennessee. But money like that can't stay still. It's got to move. So they cleaned it up, funneled it back to Texas, and from there, it made its way down to Mexico. By the year 2000, Petties' operation wasn't just big anymore, it was booming. DEA agent Abe Collins believed Petties had become the main plug for both cocaine and marijuana across Memphis. And the wild part, he was running it all with some of his childhood homies. To keep things looking clean, his crew used front businesses. Agent Collins even pointed out that they were slinging drugs right out of an auto repair shop on Elvis Presley Boulevard. And to make things seem even more legit, Petties went and filed paperwork in October 2000 to open up a company called C's Trucking. Now, in the Memphis drug scene, trucks were everything. Keith Brown from the DEA broke it down. Most of the major drugs coming into the city, whether coke, weed, or meth, were being smuggled up from Mexico. They'd roll in through I-40 or I-55, hidden deep inside 18-wheelers or cars tricked out with secret compartments. Brown said Memphis itself was a massive consumer market too. He couldn't even count the full scale, but we're talking thousands of pounds of weed, thousands of kilos of coke, and hundreds of kilos of heroin, pouring in every year. And this wasn't sloppy business, this was organized. They had specialists for everything: drivers, compartment builders, money launderers, the whole setup. While Memphis wasn't quite on Atlanta's level when it came to being a multi-state hub, Brown still called it a key regional hotspot. The Mexican cartels were the main suppliers, but they didn't control the streets. They just kept the product coming. But U.S. Attorney Larry Lorenzi saw it differently. He believed Memphis was turning into something bigger, a major hub for moving drugs through to bigger cities like Chicago. He even pushed to have the area declared a high-intensity drug trafficking area, hoping that extra federal money could help slow things down. Petties, meanwhile, had his hands in everything. He was coordinating operations across at least 8 states: Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Texas, and of course Tennessee. This wasn't just local work anymore. Then came the real turning point. Petties got introduced to a serious cartel figure, Edgar Valdez Villarreal, better known as La Barbie. He was a high-ranking boss in the Beltran Leyva cartel, part of the massive Sinaloa network. Crazy enough, La Barbie was a U.S. citizen from Laredo, Texas, known for his blonde hair, green eyes, and ruthless streak. He was infamous for the kind of violence that made headlines in Mexico. For Petties, meeting him changed everything. This partnership took him from regional player to international operator. Law enforcement had never seen a Black American brought into a Mexican cartel like that. It was unheard of. But that same alliance that made Petties powerful would one day turn dangerous for him too. He spent a week down on a ranch with the cartel, a test of loyalty, a kind of job interview with his life on the line. When they took him to Laredo, the main gateway for drug routes into the U.S., Petties showed out. He proved how fast he could move product, unloading 10 kilos of coke through his Memphis network, most of them childhood friends from Riverside. That move impressed La Barbie and sealed his place in the cartel's inner circle. From there, Petties' rise was explosive. He built serious wealth, moving major shipments across the South. By his mid-20s, he was already a multimillionaire. But he wasn't the type to be taken advantage of. He'd learned early not to play nice. Petties made a name for himself as someone you didn't cross, ever. Even his own people weren't safe if they betrayed him or even thought about talking to the feds. The drugs kept flowing into Memphis, mostly smuggled through I-55 and I-40, hidden inside trucks. These weren't small loads either. We're talking shipments between 300 and 1,100 pounds. One even hit a jaw-dropping 5,500 pounds, worth around $50 million. Some were bold enough to be sent through FedEx. Week after week, Petties was pulling in millions. His operation was so strong that it even supplied the Black Mafia family, the infamous Detroit-based drug ring. Petties had officially locked down Memphis, ruling through fear, loyalty, and power, and everyone knew it. Then came the day everything started to unravel. It's April 4th, 2001, and Memphis police pull up to a quiet house in the southwest part of the city. The call came from a woman named Latosha Booker, the girlfriend of a man named Craig Petties. When officers arrived, Petties and Booker both claimed they just had a little argument, nothing serious, everything's cool now, but the cops aren't buying it. Something about the whole scene feels off. The first red flag, the strong, unmistakable smell hanging in the air. The second, a half-burned marijuana joint sitting right on the coffee table. Then, out of nowhere, more men start walking out from different parts of the house. One of them, the homeowner, Tino Harris, gives police the green light to search the place. What they find next is no small-time stash. It's a full-on drug haul, 600 pounds of marijuana. Petties and the others get cuffed on the spot. On his arrest sheet, Petties lists his job as sea trucking, which everyone figures means commercial trucking. Booker also gets charged, but only for simple assault, and those charges never go anywhere. A judge hits Petties with a $250,000 bond, which he somehow posts, walking free not long after. Then, out of nowhere, the charges against him and a few others quietly disappear. But that moment wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something way bigger. Fast forward to the summer of 2002. Bartlett, a suburb of Memphis, becomes the center of attention after police raid another house tied to Petties' crew. This time, they find 84 pounds of cocaine hidden in the attic, worth nearly $1 million. That was the breaking point. Within months, the feds dropped a federal indictment on Petties. The DEA was convinced Petties had become one of Memphis's biggest suppliers of weed and coke. So when the heat got too hot, he did what many in his position would. He vanished, heading straight for Mexico. Nobody knows exactly when he got there, but he wasn't alone. At least 3 other members of his crew also dipped south of the border. For DEA Special Agent Abe Collins, catching Petties became a long game, 10 years long. Collins had already known about Petties through an informant before the Bartlett bust, and he led the charge that got the federal indictment rolling. He teamed up with a special task force, including Deputy U.S. Marshals and Memphis detective Thurman Richardson, who went deep undercover in 2005, grill, dreads, the whole look, to infiltrate Petties' network. But it was dangerous work. Cops later intercepted calls from Petties' locked-up associates talking about putting hits on both Richardson and Collins. They even had Collins' home address. Richardson had to warn his wife and made sure his kids never played outside or walked to school alone again. Collins faced another uphill battle, getting people to testify. Some were too scared to speak, even law enforcement insiders. And honestly, they had every reason to be terrified. Petties' hitmen had already proven they weren't playing around. One even killed a childhood friend of Petties who tried to leave the operation and work with the feds. Back in Memphis, prosecutors ramped things up using RICO laws, originally designed to take down the mafia, but now aimed at Petties' organization. Under RICO, if the group commits a crime, everyone in it can go down for it. That scared the hell out of Petties' crew. Facing life sentences, some of his closest allies flipped, cutting deals and spilling everything they knew. The investigation eventually stretched beyond U.S. borders. Collins and his team took trips to Mexico, working hand in hand with local law enforcement to close in on Petties. By 2004, Petties was officially one of America's most wanted. The U.S. Marshals put him on their top 15 most wanted list, plastering his face everywhere. The bulletin warned that he was armed and dangerous, wanted on 45 counts. At that point, Petties knew his time was running out. He ditched his phone, convinced the feds were listening in. The walls were closing in fast and he could feel it. But here's where things get real wild. A U.S. official later admitted that corruption played a big part in why Craig Petties stayed free for so long. Word on the street was Petties had people tipping him off whenever law enforcement got too close. Every time the heat rose, he'd just pack up and move, sliding from one Mexican city to the next like smoke. And believe it or not, Mexican authorities actually spotted him more than once. But even when they had him in their sights, he somehow slipped through their fingers. That's how much power the cartels had, money and muscle so deep that even police couldn't touch him. Eventually, Petties found peace in the state of Querétaro, just a few hours north of Mexico City. He bought himself a house in a fancy neighborhood called Milenio 3, tucked up in the hills of Santiago de Querétaro. To picture it, think of this. You're driving up a steep hill, passing through the noise, the traffic, and the street performers breathing fire for tips. You roll past cozy cafes and speed bumps that force you to slow down, then pull into a neighborhood full of massive homes, some looking like they came straight out of a fairy tale. Petties, though, wasn't living large. His spot was a simple white stucco house on a cobblestone street, nothing flashy. When reporters showed up later, the place was empty and up for rent. It looked out over a deep valley filled with cactus, hummingbirds, and red stone cliffs. Way down below, You could see cars, trucks, and trains. Ironically, the same kind of stuff Petties used to hit back in his Memphis days. His time in Mexico is mostly a mystery. The U.S. Embassy stayed quiet, and Mexican officials weren't talking either. But one thing came through loud and clear: Petties had serious backing. According to former Mexican Attorney General Eduardo Medina Mora, Petties was protected by the Beltran Leyva cartel. These were heavy hitters, brothers who'd once been part of the powerful Sinaloa cartel before breaking off to form their own empire. Petties already had business ties with them in the U.S., and he eventually became one of their brokers. That meant he was the man responsible for moving their product north, getting drugs across the border fast using his American connections. He bought cocaine straight from Colombian suppliers, with the Beltran Leyvas acting as middlemen. They kept him on a leash, letting him buy only 500 kilos at a time, but that one load worth around $10 million in the States. The operation was tight. The coke came into Mexico by submarines and barges before crossing the Texas border. Petty's people were creative with their smuggling, stuffing those aromatic bricks inside legit shipments like food deliveries, or hiding them in custom truck compartments. And when that wasn't enough, bribes handled the rest, making sure Border Patrol agents looked the other way. Even from across the border, Petties still ran things like a boss. He ordered hits, managed shipments, and moved serious weight, tons of weed and hundreds of kilos of cocaine, all funneled into Tennessee and surrounding states. His right-hand men, the Lewis cousins, handled everything on U.S. soil. They set up stash houses, arranged deliveries, moved money, and even looked after Petties' mother. Here's the crazy twist. Going to Mexico might have made Petties' operation even stronger. According to DEA agent Abe Collins, Petties' move allowed him to stretch his network beyond Memphis into Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Texas. By 2007, the feds knew exactly where their kingpin was, living the good life in Mexico, but his money was still flowing. Couriers kept the cash coming in, like the two guys caught in South Texas back in 2004 with $129,000 in drug money headed his way. Petties ran everything through cell phones, turning his empire into a long-distance hustle. Some of his Memphis lieutenants even flew down to Mexico to meet with him. One of them, Orlando Pride, said they met in Acapulco in 2004, where Petties handed them a coded contact sheet, a list of numbers matched to letters so their calls couldn't be traced. His crew stayed sharp. They switched phones constantly, changed numbers every few days, and one of Petties' lieutenants even smashed his phone after every conversation. Petties himself disguised his voice on calls just in case. That kind of paranoia kept him one step ahead of the feds for years. But it also showed how deep his fear ran. Petties had built an empire, but by 2007, the walls were closing in. His top lieutenants were getting picked off one by one, and snitches were popping up everywhere. Informants were cutting deals, wearing wires, and recording conversations just to shave time off their sentences. And inside the operation, the betrayal hit hard. At least one undercover cop, Detective Thurman Richardson from Memphis PD, had managed to get in deep, gathering evidence that would eventually tear the whole thing down. Now, while Petties was ducked off living life on the run, his half-brother Paul Beauregard, better known as DJ Paul from the legendary 3-6 Mafia, was doing the exact opposite. He was out in the open, blowing up in the music world. By 2004, 3-6 Mafia was on fire. They'd landed a deal with Columbia Records, started producing their own movies, and were riding high off their gritty, Memphis-made sound. Then came 2006, when DJ Paul and his crew hit a level of fame no one saw coming. They won an Academy Award for the song It's Hard Out Here for a Pimp, the anthem from Hustle and Flow. Their success was massive. According to Nielsen SoundScan, 3-6 Mafia sold over 6.4 million albums, and their influence reached far beyond Memphis. Their songs, though, painted a dark, unfiltered picture of street life with titles like "Let's Plan a Robbery" and "They Bout to Find Yo Body." Even their track Trap Boom was straight up about the hustle, spitting lines like, "I went to Key West and picked it up, back in Memphis, broke it up." That kind of raw storytelling made their sound global, so much so that even kids in Querétaro, Mexico, knew their music. But down in Mexico, the reality for law enforcement was no music video. The danger was real. Cops had to wear ski masks just to hide their faces, and prosecutors were banned from keeping family photos in their offices so their loved ones wouldn't become targets. That's how serious things were. So, how did Petties finally get caught in a place that dangerous? It started in 2007 when a man walked into the offices of Querétaro officials claiming he represented Arturo Beltran Leyva, one of Mexico's most feared cartel leaders. He offered them a deal: let the cartel operate freely, and in return, the cartel would pay them whatever they wanted every month. In the US, that kind of offer would sound crazy, but in Mexico, where corruption runs deep, it wasn't unheard of. Still, the officials told him no, and that's when things took a turn. They started tracking that man, and before long, their investigation led them to a quiet neighborhood where someone important was hiding. Turns out that someone was Craig Petties. Some folks believe there were other forces in play, but officially, that's how it went down. After 5 years on the run, Petties was finally cornered. He was 31 years old when Mexican military and police stormed his white stucco home in Santiago de Querétaro on January 10th, 2008. The whole scene looked like something out of a movie: snipers on rooftops, a helicopter hovering overhead, officers surrounding the property. Petties tried his usual move, trying to bribe his way out, talking to the officers in Spanish and flashing cash. But this time, it didn't work. They locked him up right there. Sadly, his kids, his twin 4-year-old boys, a 10-year-old girl, and a 16-year-old daughter were all inside the house. They were taken to a facility while their mother, Latosha Booker, was out dropping off their baby with a nanny. Eventually, she made it back to the US with all the children. Petties didn't get that same mercy. He was deported straight to Houston, then flown to Memphis. A whole squad of federal agents and prosecutors actually flew out just to see him in person, the man they'd spent years chasing. And when they finally came face to face with the feared kingpin, he broke down crying, wiping tears and sniffling through the interview. When they asked if he ever knew he couldn't run forever, all he said was, "I knew." By the time Petties was caught, he wasn't just a dealer. He was running one of the largest drug operations in the South, connected directly to a branch of Mexico's notorious Beltran Leyva cartel. Authorities seized over $3 million in assets: cash, cars, luxury homes, the whole setup. 17 years of hustling and stacking came crashing down in one night. Once he hit US soil, the feds had a plan. Petties didn't want to talk at first, but they used leverage: his kids. They told him his youngest children, all born in Mexico under fake names, wouldn't be allowed back into the States unless he cooperated. So he did. The details of that agreement are sealed, but it said he gave up deep intel on his entire operation. Locked up at the Federal Correctional Institution in Memphis, Petties stayed quiet for a while. Prosecutors tried to tempt him with witness protection and even a name change, but he wasn't fooled. He knew what he was up against. "Wherever you put me, they'll kill me," he told them. He was talking about the Sinaloa cartel, and he wasn't wrong. Still, in December 2009, Petties made a big move. Behind closed doors, he pled guilty to 19 federal charges, everything from drug trafficking and racketeering to money laundering and even ordering 4 murders. As part of his deal, he flipped. He gave investigators everything: names, routes, logistics, money trails. His cooperation helped the feds tear down parts of the Beltran Leyva cartel's US network and convict several of his top lieutenants. When the smoke cleared, the government had seized millions: cars, weapons, mansions, and cash. But even after all that, it's believed some of Petties' fortune is still floating somewhere out there, untouched and unclaimed. The federal government came down hard on Craig Petties. They hit him with a massive 50-count indictment stacked with conspiracy charges tied to 6 murders and a long list of racketeering offenses. When it all kicked off, Petties tried to play it straight, entering a plea of not guilty. But the feds weren't bluffing. They built their case under the RICO Act, the same law they used to take down the mafia. Prosecutors leaned heavy on Petties' people, pressuring them to talk to save themselves from life sentences. Some folded, some stayed quiet, but the message was clear: cooperate or get buried by the system. The trial was supposed to start in September 2012, but it got pushed to November. When it finally went down, things got dangerous fast. Some of Petties' former associates took the stand, admitting they followed his direct orders to kill a man who had flipped and become a government witness. Law enforcement already knew how wild things could get. They'd been listening in on jail calls where Petties' crew plotted to take out the 2 lead investigators, DEA agent Abe Collins and Memphis detective Thurman Richardson. Both men had already risked their lives chasing this case, and now their names were being tossed around as potential targets. Out of everyone in Petties' organization, only 2 of his enforcers, cousins Clinton and Martin Lewis, demanded a trial. They lost. The jury found them guilty, and both were sentenced to life without parole. No second chances, no appeals that would change anything. Security during the trial was on another level. Jurors' names were kept secret, even from the judge, and they were escorted every day by armed U.S. Marshals from an undisclosed location. Spectators, including the mother of one of the victims, couldn't even watch the proceedings in the courtroom. They had to sit 8 floors below in a secured room with a video feed that never showed the jurors' faces. That's how real the fear was surrounding Petties' empire. One name that kept coming up was Christopher Hamlet. He wasn't just another associate. He was Petties' childhood friend who eventually joined the operation. Hamlet had already spent 5 years locked up in a Mexican prison before being sentenced in Memphis. As part of his plea deal, which earned him 15 years, he dropped bombshell information linking Petties to murders in Mexico that Petties had never mentioned to prosecutors. And Petties wasn't doing himself any favors behind bars either. While awaiting trial in Memphis, guards found a 6-inch shank hidden in his mattress. He tried to play it off, claiming it was just plastic from a meal tray, but prosecutors proved it was a metal blade he'd sharpened himself. That stunt got him transferred from Memphis to Atlanta and then again to New York under sealed court orders. Once there, he was thrown straight into solitary confinement. At this point, Petties was staring down the possibility of the death penalty for those 6 murders, plus life for all the racketeering charges. Everything came to a head on August 22, 2013, when U.S. District Court Judge Samuel Hardy Mays handed down the final sentence, 9 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Before the gavel dropped, Petties spoke. He turned to the victims' families and apologized, saying he was sorry for the choices that brought him there. It was short, quiet, and too late to change anything. Judge Mays told the courtroom that Petties had committed the most serious crimes he had ever seen and made it clear that this sentence was meant to send a message. U.S. Attorney Ed Stanton III put it plainly: 1 life sentence says enough, but 9 drives the point home. The courtroom was tense, especially when Lucy Turner, the mother of Marcus Turner, one of Petties' victims, stood up to speak. Her son had been kidnapped, tortured, and killed by Petties' crew. Through tears, she told the court, "He's damaged so many lives. I just ask you, give him whatever the law allows. He can talk to his family. I can't talk to my son." For Lucy, this day was her closure. She said she could finally rest, knowing Petties would never walk free again. "I can get peace of mind with this," she said. "We can bury Daddy for good now." Marcus had 4 kids, and Lucy now raises his daughter, Marcia, who wanted to know what would happen in court that day. Lucy told her this was the last time they could finally move on. Stanton later said the pain went beyond the victims' families. The whole community had suffered from the violence, addiction, and chaos Petties unleashed on Memphis. His organization poisoned neighborhoods and left scars that would take generations to heal. By the end of it all, 40 of Petties' associates were prosecuted and the entire operation was wiped out. Lucy Turner, who had sat through every single hearing, finally walked out of the courthouse for the last time saying, "I don't have to come anymore, no more." Petties' cooperation didn't earn him a shorter sentence, but Judge Mays granted one small request: to have him placed in a prison close to Memphis so his elderly mother, wife, and children could visit. Years later, though, he was moved again, this time to the U.S. Penitentiary in Tucson, Arizona, where he sits today as inmate number 82,553-179. Even locked up, Petties' name still echoes through the streets of South Memphis. He's become part of local legend, half myth, half warning. Some people rock t-shirts with his face on them, others post about him online, split between admiration and disgust. You'll see comments ranging from "put him in the ground" to "trying to get that Craig Petties money." His story stands as a brutal reminder of how deep the game runs and how easily the streets can pull you in, only to chew you up and never let you go.